Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, August 13th, 2021, and today I'm going to be talking about the Virginia gubernatorial race, pretty much an update as to where this race stands today based off the preliminary election polling data. Now, I first want to say that I apologize for any background noise. There is a huge storm going on in Washington, D.C. It seems that we've had a lot of storms recently, unfortunately, and it probably will only get worse as the years go on. But for right now, there is one that is just absolutely obliterating everything outside right in front of me. It's dark at 5 p.m. It's not too good, but I will say that if there is any background noise, I do apologize for that in advance, and that I will try to, at least when I'm in college, be in a more soundproof area. So that's the detracting from the focus of this video. Today, we are focusing on this Virginia race because of Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin in a very competitive position. As you see on your screen, the most recent poll, the most recent one actually that we've seen in weeks, from July 25th to July 27th, unfortunately, it was published in August, so I don't know entirely why they waited to release it so long. This is, and I'm going to tell you for the sake of transparency early on, this is a Republican internal pollster, which means that they typically lean towards the right. You can actually see here that this was done by conservatives for clean energy, so this poll was done primarily for the GOP, more so I think as an insider reference as to where they are, but they do publish the polls at the end of the day. A lot of the times these are kept within the campaign, but it seems that they want to reveal these numbers for whatever reason. And so far, for whatever reason as well, every single poll that has been released for this individual race, every single one has been done by a Republican, except for this one, I believe, which is JMC Analytics. Beyond that, the rest have been entirely done solely by Republican internals. And you can actually see that here when you take a look at these numbers. And I guess I was wrong. I thought JMC Analytics was going to be a nonpartisan pollster. I was wrong about that. So looking at this race, you will see here that Terry McAuliffe pretty much takes the lead and has maintained such a lead since June of 2021 for the past 2 months. And it makes sense. Virginia is a blue state. There's no way getting around that. Right now, Democrats have a trifecta on the national level, but also on the statewide level in the state of Virginia. In 2017, they won the Virginia gubernatorial race against Ed Gillespie, keeping it in the column. The governor before Ralph Northam was actually Terry McAuliffe, the 2021 Democratic nominee for governor that's on this ballot sooner. Looking in 2019, Democrats flipped the House of Delegates from being in the minority now into the majority. In the state Senate, they went from being in the minority into the majority following 2019. Now in 2021, as it stands today, Virginia seems to be continuing where they are. And if you're wondering how long we have until the November election in the state of Virginia, we have 81 days until then. Elections come right around the corner in American politics, and it never seems like there is time to rest when it comes to the American political system. And that has proven to be right about this competitive Virginia gubernatorial race. And while there isn't a lot of polling data, I'm just fascinated by the fact that there are simply only Republican internals across this race. But it also makes a little bit of sense. In 2017, in the polls that were taken earlier on, there wasn't much. There wasn't much taken, if at all. You can see here that there were occasional polls from Quinnipiac, Gravis, Washington Post, but these were taken ever so often. In January, then one in all of February, then one in all of March, one in all of April, one in all of May, one in all of June, 2 in July, and 2 in August. So we are sort of behind in terms of pace, but it makes also just a bit more sense because 2020 was, quite interestingly enough, more wrong in terms of the polling data than 2016. And I know that's weird to think about, but it's absolutely true. And maybe some of these more major pollsters are just holding off because they don't want to be wrong. And also, maybe because they don't think it's worthwhile investing in this race. If all of the Republican internals are saying that Democrats are going to win, when in 2017, even non-Republican internals said Ed Gillespie was going to win, he ended up losing by 9. It wouldn't make sense to poll a safe state, at least in the eyes of the media. But it's not a safe state. You can't classify Virginia as a safe state. But at this point in time, 4 years ago, there weren't much polls out there anyway. But we should start to see it ramp up over the next couple of months. If we don't, it'll largely be, I think, these polling companies protecting their legitimacy after the 2020 election, but polls actually weren't too far off in Virginia in 2020. I think Biden was expected to win by 11 in Virginia. He ended up winning by 10 across the state. So the polls seem to be pretty spot on, well within the margin of error. So what is happening in this individual poll that we see here? Well, Terry McAuliffe, sometimes I'll refer to him as T-Mac just because it seems to be the slang version of his name. But Terry McAuliffe is up 5 points statewide over Glenn Youngkin. And you can see here that Blanding, the other candidate, receives 2%. This 5% margin of victory is actually a little bit larger than what we've seen in some of the other polls recently speaking. Terry McAuliffe took a 2-point lead with the Trafalgar Group, a 5-point lead with Spry Strategies, just a 4-point lead with JMC Analytics, and an even narrower 2-point lead with WPAI, which is a pollster that is, all of these are Republican internals, that released the first ever poll for this race. And it showed that Terry McAuliffe was leading, but not necessarily by a large amount. Now, 2% is very different than 5%, especially when it comes down to gubernatorial races, because that just shows that there seems to be a larger portion of the public more inclined to vote for Terry McAuliffe now than at the start of all of these polls. But it also is interesting to point out that Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin have received the narrowest, or not necessarily the narrowest, the smallest amount of vote share in this most recent poll as compared to the rest of the numbers. You could say Terry McAuliffe has decreased 3 points over time, but margins are what matters. There is no type of runoff rule in the state of Virginia. You can win a race by a plurality. In 2013, when Terry McAuliffe won his governorship for the first time, he won by a plurality. The Libertarian received 7% of the vote. In 2017, while Ralph Northam won by a plurality, he won by 9 points, but only received 4 points more than the majority needed. The Libertarian received 1% of the vote. So looking at elections in Virginia and around the nation, in most cases, you can win by a plurality. So if these numbers were to be pushed on to the 2021 in November, if this was the final result, Terry McAuliffe would win. There would be no type of December or January election like you might see in a state such as Georgia or another state. And actually, those runoff elections typically only occur when it comes down to Senate races, not necessarily governor races. So what are we seeing here? 5-point lead. That's, service level, 5-point lead, pretty strong for Terry McAuliffe. No real way to go around that. He is in a position where he probably won't perform nearly as well as Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden won the state of Virginia by an exceptionally large margin in 2020, but he could get somewhere within that point. You see, because the Democrats have a 10-point pretty much advantage over the GOP when you look at the most recent election results, it allows Terry McAuliffe room to fall. And he certainly has fallen. I mean, Terry McAuliffe is not going to be the second, coming of Joe Biden when it comes down to this Virginia gubernatorial race. Joe Biden was the best performing Democrat in the state for presidential elections since 1944. I mean, are you kidding me? Joe Biden did very well for Democrats in 2020 in this state. And despite a number of other states being more competitive, or at least as narrow as they were in 2016 for the case of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Joe Biden was able to push Virginia to the left by nearly 5 points. Nearly 5 points when he moved Pennsylvania by 2, right? Moved Wisconsin by 2. Moved, other states, narrower amounts. Even moved the state of Arizona by a narrower amount than what he moved the state of Virginia towards the left. So what I expect to see, I think, primarily speaking, for the Democrats in this race is a lot of what the polls seem to suggest. I'm comfortable saying that right now I would expect Terry McAuliffe to win by 5 points across the state. Looking at the most recent election results, Democrats will also likely do well in the state Senate election and in the House of Delegates election. The reality of the situation is that with the Democratic Party at this point, they have a larger portion of support in 2021 than they did in 2017, than they did in 2016, than they did in 2019 or 18. Democrats seem to be increasing the amount of votes that they get, primarily from the Northern Virginia region, the region of the state that was very crucial for Terry McAuliffe's victory back in 2013 and Ralph Northam's. And Joe Biden performed better than both of these candidates across the Northern Virginia region, right on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. So looking at these polls, looking at the most recent one, it only confirms the initial belief that Virginia is a blue state and that Democrats are doing well. You see, we're not going to be focusing too much on a lot of the numbers here, but let's go ahead and see if we can find the final numbers. The fact that this poll, and again, it is a Republican internal, so I do want you to understand that there will be some type of Republican advantage. That is also a takeaway that you should have been getting by the fact that I consistently mentioned that it had an R by the name. This means that Republicans will do better in these polls than they actually will. And Virginia, surprisingly enough, has an interesting history of underestimating Democratic support when it comes to gubernatorial races, going to even the most recent gubernatorial race in which Ralph Northam was expected to win by 3.3%. He won by 8.9%. Ed Gillespie was just 0.6 off of what he was expected to get. Ralph Northam was over 6 points off, meaning that there was a 6-point bump for Ralph Northam with the final results here. So just keep that in mind when you see that R by the name of the pollster. Understand that Republicans typically should do better in their own internals because the messaging, the questioning almost always will favor the Republicans more. But looking at Virginia, they ask, do you approve of the job that Joe Biden is doing as president? Just 47% of voters say they approve, and 46% say they disapprove. Well, considering that Virginia is more Democratic than the rest of the nation, I don't buy these numbers. Considering that the nation approves of Joe Biden seems to tell me that because the nation does, Virginia should buy a marginally or maybe larger, higher margin than the one that you see on the 538 national scale or the Real Clear Politics national scale, but it's not what you see, which means that this electorate itself seems to be, of the poll at least, more conservative than the rest of the nation. Keep that in mind when you realize that Terry McAuliffe is winning in this poll by 5%. They ask, who would you vote for? With 13% undecided, I can tell you now, though, that that's not a good number for Terry McAuliffe. More people should be decided at that point if he wants to be confident about an election result. And I'll talk about how Democrats should feel by the end of this video, about how they should feel about this poll. They should be looking at it with some type of worry, but also pretty okay with where they stand today. But you can see here that they ask questions about wind power, solar power. Again, this is for clean energy. They ask about emerging technologies and utilities, not necessarily the standard types of questions that you would actually see. And, most of it is focused on that. Again, Republican internal, a lot of this is just used for their own information, for where they need to divert their resources the most, what type of education they need to provide the voters with about certain cases. But they throw in these questions because they also allow the Republicans and Democrats to understand where they are. And if you're looking at this as well, the amount of voters that say Virginia is going off on the wrong track, 47% to 35% saying in the right direction, I also don't buy it. Looking at the state of Virginia has actually had some pretty good growth over the past 4 years, whether it has to do with the national economy with Donald Trump as president, whether it has to do with Ralph Northam as the governor of the state, whether it has to do with Republicans controlling half of the 4 years and Democrats controlling the other half when it came down to the state of Virginia, whatever it might be. Things seem to be working out in that state. People are flocking to the state of Virginia. Businesses are focusing on the state. And it doesn't have to do exactly with Democratic legislation or Republican legislation. But if 47% of Virginia is saying that they are going in the wrong track and only 35% are saying that they are, it probably has less to do with how they actually feel about Terry McAuliffe or Ralph Northam or Democrats or Republicans, but maybe more about COVID-19. Or mask mandates, whatever it might be. Yes, 47% is a number that you could maybe see on the national scale, but I don't necessarily buy it for the state of Virginia. I personally believe that based off of a lot of these questions, that this exact polled demographic group, this breakdown as chosen by coefficient, and this Conservatives for Clean Energy, their polling group is more conservative than the rest of the state, or at least more conservative than they should be. Not a perfect representation of the state of Virginia. And while you always are going to get a one-off, not necessarily the best numbers, you also have to keep in mind this is a Republican internal. So they don't necessarily care if they're just slightly off. But it can truly throw off a lot of numbers, especially when there have been some very close races in 2020, in 2016, in 2017 even. A very close race. In fact, a House of Delegates race, the Republican majority came down to a coin toss. That's how close some of these races get. So you need to understand that polling groups, while won't necessarily be perfect, cannot be as wrong as we seem to see them right now. Because 47% of the nation, more than that, approves of Joe Biden as president. If they expect a state that was 5 points to the left of the national to be worse for Joe Biden, either it means that Joe Biden is really screwing up, which clearly is not the case, that the national still puts him in the positive, but it could just mean more that the pollster is off itself. So, main takeaways here. What's the point? Even with these increased, Republican polls and more data coming in, they still can't put the GOP ahead. In fact, from the first poll, the first Republican internal, to the last one, we have seen a 3-point increase for the Democratic Party's margin of victory. Virginia once again proving that it is a blue state. And I also look at this as where were times in which Glenn Youngkin could have won this race. Earlier on seemed to be his best opportunity, but too many scandals and missteps have entered into the way that make it very difficult for him to win in the end. And as of right now, I do not expect him to win this race. Democrats, though, and this is what I should say when it comes down to the race, should look at it and be cautiously optimistic. Well, what does that mean? That means they need to be careful. They can't be super confident in a Terry McAuliffe victory. But it also means that they should be hopeful that this race probably will go in their favor, but they still need to be conscious. They still need to be aware of what's happening across the state. Races have turned from left to right in 2 weeks. In 2016, Hillary Clinton went from up being 8 points nationally speaking down to 2 points on election day in a matter of 2 weeks. It's fascinating to see how quick American politics can change. But in Virginia right now, Democrats should remain cautiously optimistic. They should not let up. They should not end up stopping ad spending in certain regions of the state. Oh, we have it locked down. Northern Virginia will be just as Democrat as it was in 2020. These types of statements are reasons why Democrats lose. They need to stop being complacent. And right now, I don't think they are. They're doing very well with ad spending in terms of organizing. They seem to be keeping up their phone banking efforts, even though there seemed to have been a slight bump from the Joe Biden rally that he held in Arlington. But looking at this race itself, Democrats, 2 words: cautiously optimistic about where this race stands today and where it is. Personal update about what this race, where I think it stands. Terry McAuliffe, I think, will be in a point where he wins between 4 and 6%, but times can change. American politics can just flip upside down overnight, and the same can be applied to the state of Virginia. Just for right now, none of those nights have been beneficial for Glenn Youngkin. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2021 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.